My name is Owen Stanwood. I'm an associate professor of history at Boston College, and I wanted to welcome you all to our panel discussion today for the panel on new perspectives on the Huguenots. And I want to start off by just briefly introducing the panelists, and then I'm going to discuss a little bit some of the questions that I had listening to their excellent papers today. And then we're going to have a bit of a general discussion of the papers and about the larger themes that are that come out of their work. So our three panelists today are Tom Sosnowski, who is the professor of history at Kent State University. Second, Nora Taylor, who is a doctoral student at Jesus College, University of Oxford. And finally, we have Tommy Barr, who is a practicing artist from Northern Ireland near the town of Lisburn, I believe, who's going to give who has given a very different kind of perspective on the history and memory of the Huguenots. And I did want to just start by pointing out that today, when we're making this recording, is June 20th. And I noted a couple hours ago that it is actually International Refugee Day. So I think that that is very appropriate that we're having this discussion because it demonstrates the way in which the issues raised by these papers and by the story of the Huguenots more generally is something that is, I think, as Tommy said in his paper, is sadly still relevant to us today. And I think that's something I hope we can talk about in the discussion to come. Now, these three papers raise many interesting issues about the place of Huguenots in France and beyond, both in the 17th century, but also in kind of the realm of memory that brings us, I think, right up to the present. And I wanted to just move chronologically through the three papers and raise a couple of questions before our discussion. Starting with Tom Sosnowski's paper, he deals mostly with the role of the Huguenots in the Fronde and the responses to them in the Mazarinade, which I've never really encountered or thought about much before. This is really kind of a lost period, I think, in Huguenot history, and it's great to see it kind of brought into light a little bit more. The Huguenots were famously either silent or supportive of the king for the most part during that dispute, but at the same time, pamphleteers often brought up Protestantism, usually in ways that were based on prejudice or religious objections, and often gestured both to the Huguenots' supposedly rebellious principles, but also to contemporary events in England. And I'm most interested in how we explain the Fronde in kind of the larger longue durée of Huguenot history, especially if we don't have a whole lot of Protestant voices. And I want to actually push you a little bit on kind of recovering a Huguenot side to this. And I'm particularly wondering why the Huguenots were so supportive of the monarchy. And if this was purely kind of out of realpolitik, out of, they simply had no more options left after the fall of La Rochelle, or if there was some sort of philosophical or perhaps even theological argument behind it. And I also had kind of a counterfactual question, which is, if La Rochelle had gone differently, if the Peace of Alais had not happened as it had, would they have come to a different decision about the Fronde? Would they have maybe cast, at least some of them cast joined the Frondeur instead of Louis XIV? Moving on to Nora Taylor's really excellent paper, she moves us forward several decades to the 1680s when Louis has turned his back on limited toleration. And we meet the character, at least new to me, of Blanche Gamond and her experience at the Hôpital de Valence. And it's fascinating for all sorts of reasons. I really want to read this narrative in full now, but the main thing that struck me was Gamond as kind of an ideal of active female resistance in the era of the Dragonnade and the Revocation, which just doesn't seem like something I've seen very much in the Huguenot literature of this time period. And that she not only shows herself as a martyr, which I think you argue very well that she does, but also as a knowledgeable interlocutor about religion in particular, as someone who's not scared of a debate and who actually argues specifically about women's active role in religious disputes. So my question about this paper is largely about kind of the literary nature of this source, because you mentioned that it's a manuscript and that it's not published until the 19th century. So I'm wondering if you know anything about both, who her audience was. Was she going to circulate this manuscript? Did she want to get it published and it just never was published for whatever reason? And what does that kind of attention to the textuality or the circumstances of the text, what does this tell us about kind of where she fits in the larger story of Huguenot literature, thinking about Pierre Jurieu and others who are more, whose works were published and circulated in France and beyond at the time. Finally, moving to Tommy Barr's paper and presentation, we move from France to the Refuge and specifically to Ireland. And Barr's paper relates the story of the refugees there, the journey from La Rochelle to Lisburn, Waterford, Dublin, Cork, and kind of discusses the larger context of their settlement around the island. But the real star, obviously, is the phenomenal artwork, which serves to invite us to ponder the role of Huguenots in popular memory in Ireland and beyond. I'm really sad I can't see the art in person. I feel like that would be, that I could appreciate it even more, but I could appreciate it perfectly well in the presentation as well. I particularly like the way that you're able to kind of use objects from the communities themselves as kind of pieces of memory that come from the history to try to kind of understand the ways that the Huguenots are remembered in Ireland. My question is, I wanted to kind of interrogate a little bit more the way that Huguenots fit in Irish memory. Because clearly, I mean, they're religious migrants, they're also economic migrants. You talk about linen and that, their economic purpose, but they also came to fight in a war. In the Williamite Wars, which of course are very, have a fraught meaning in Ireland even to this day. So I'm wondering how memories of the Huguenot migration fit in with memories of Protestant Catholic conflict in particular. And if these, I know that in the United States, for instance, in a place like South Carolina, and we're talking a lot about memorialization of slavery, Huguenot memory has been very much complicated by their ties to slavery. And I wonder if there's something similar in Ireland about Huguenot links to the Williamite cause and kind of the Protestant ascendancy. So I think I'll let the panelists respond, and then maybe we can move from there into a more general conversation about these themes.
Well, let's see if I remember all of the questions, but you have some really great questions. Actually, this project is a part of what I hope will be a larger project, because I would like to take really a close look at those really about 50 pamphlets that were written by the Huguenots and see exactly what they had to say. And as the only, I read some of them, and I did not be able to get my hands on a few of them, but there were only two that actually sounded anti-government, anti-monarchical. And there was one by Francois Galbin, who actually praised what he called the Republic in England, which was a very dangerous thing to do. And I'm really surprised he was able to get away with it. But it was a time of the Fronde, and at that time, you could publish just about anything. And with over 5,000 pamphlets being published, you can imagine, and they were sold on the streets. The Côte d'Alter sold them for a couple of sous at the very most, and they were quite popular. The only question, sometimes the big question is how many pamphlets were actually, how many issues were actually in each one of these, and so how were they distributed? I do know that they were not just for one person. They were, passed from one person to another. And for your other question, why do they remain silent? Because they felt precarious. The other one is, it seems as if, at least from, and sorry, but I forgot his name, but he's in my footnote, but I remember the name. You know how that is.
Yeah.
but he claims that there was no by this time no real leader who wanted to take a kind of leadership against the government. In fact,
Mhm.
they preferred to work with the government rather than against the government, so that
Mhm.
in a sense they were trying to gain brownie points. They were trying to
Mhm.
get the little, little gold stars, and so the king would be our Mazarin really was going to be happy with them. So there's no reason to subject them to anything else. And as
Mhm.
you notice, there was only one time that they were subjected to something, and that was in terms of taking away the chamber of the edict and
Mhm.
turning any kind of complaint over to the Parlement of Paris.
Mhm.
Uh, and the Parlement of Paris was known for being a bit more rigorous in its treatment of the Huguenots. So does that give a kind of an answer?
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Okay, okay, we can continue with that. But I mean, what I found surprising is that there were really so few complaints from the Huguenot, uh, uh, well, constituent. But I'm also given the impression, at least from one historian, that the Huguenots were not united at that time. They
Mhm.
were divided into a number of factions. And
Right.
so there were factions disagreeing with one another
Mhm.
over, as the best I can figure out, some little item of faith. And
Mhm.
as you know, with dogmatic stuff, one item can lead to a big disagreement. And so if you don't agree on this one, you're going to hell. And so there was that kind of dissidence that was going on.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a
thank you. Good,
constant in
good
Huguenot
question.
history. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that
But I
seems
want
like
to
it's kind of a
continue.
constant.
I really do want to continue on with the project.
Well, I hope that you do. It's a really fascinating project, and I think it's,
And now that
like I
so many
said.
of and now many of the pamphlets are online. There is a
Mhm.
special arrangement, and that is wonderful because they
Mhm.
don't have to try to go through. I really cannot spend my time in the Bibliothèque Nationale anymore, and I have problems reading. So having them online is wonderful.
Mhm. Mhm. Great. Well, maybe Nora, do you want to
Sure.
add
Yeah.
to
Well,
that?
actually, just to piggyback off what you mentioned about reading things online being good, if you are interested in reading the full narrative of Blanche's story,
Mhm.
it's available on Gallica,
Oh,
the VNF's website, so you can read that
oh,
for
okay.
yourself as well.
Great,
Um,
great.
but yeah, thanks for picking up on the literary aspect of the paper, because I am actually in the literature department, the French
Mhm.
literature department, and not the history myself. But I enjoy trying to cross disciplinary boundaries as well. So yeah, I'm also very interested in the fact that as a young woman, she was she presents herself as a very active agent of resistance during this very difficult time. And I think she wasn't um, completely unusual in this regard. There were a number of other women who we found texts. People have found texts surviving that have described their experience of captivity. Some of the better known ones include Anne de Chauffier. I'm not sure if there's
Mhm.
any familiarity with that, but to be fair, in respect to male surviving narratives,
Mhm.
particularly galley slave narratives, there are quite a lot more of those.
Mhm.
What I wanted to do with this paper was kind of focus on one of the longest and most detailed
Mhm.
of these female narratives, and offer a literary perspective, and kind of influenced by the work of scholars such as Ruth Whelan, who's done a lot of work with galley slave
Mhm.
narratives, and I wanted to kind of um, also adapt this kind of literary angle to works written by women. And I was particularly interested in this a place of the Hôpital de Valence, because it was seemingly so notorious. Even in Benoit's history of the Edict of Nantes, he says that all the other prisons kind of don't compare to it.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of the audience, I think that's something that I'm looking into at the moment. We know that she claims to have written her manuscript because her friend, someone called Madame Skera in a place of Saint Gall in Switzerland, asked her to, and also because her pastor, who was constantly in contact with her via letter during her confinement, requested her to in one of his final letters to her before she was released, he asked her to write a complete narrative describing the entirety of her experience, because he wanted to publish this in the Lettre Pastorale. Afterwards, she was released, and he instead published the last letter that she sent him in Lettre Pastorale, which is something that David van der Linden has commented on as well, that he seems to have opted to print this last letter that she sent him when he wasn't able to get the full narrative before she was released. And I was also intrigued by the fact that there's seems to be two copies existing of the manuscript. So I'm not sure which one is the original. According to the 1867 edition, Théodore Claparède, who compiled that, comments that one of those copies is held in the Bibliothèque de Genève, and it's still there according to their website. So I was supposed to go there and consult it in person, but this has been called off because of COVID-19. But it's in the collection of papers that belong to Antoine Court. So he was clearly aware of this and gathered in his collection. That there was also apparently a manuscript in private hands in Lausanne. So I'm not sure. It would be interesting to try and track that down. But considering that was in the late 1800s, that it was supposedly in Lausanne, I'm not sure if that other copy is still surviving. But yeah, that's something that I'm looking to look into as well. I was also thinking that it's possible that she told her story to other refugees when she settled in Switzerland. Near the end of her narrative, after she is released, she meets a lot of friends of her family who comment on the fact that they're aware that she was sent to the Hôpital de Valence, and they praise her for her strength, of her having held on so well, and it's likely that she told her story in one of the actes de reconnaissance, as Caroline Chapelugy has explored as well, and giving a testimony of her experience to other refugees. So it's likely that she kind of had the concerns of this community in Switzerland in mind when she was penning it.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if manuscript circulation is a tactic that these either refugees or Huguenots within France are consciously using, or if it's more like people are writing their narratives hoping to get them published somewhere, and then for one reason or another they just never get published. Because I feel like I've read a number of these unpublished narratives from the same period, and I've actually been to the Bibliothèque de Genève and looked through some of the Antoine Court papers, which are really fabulous. When the world reopens, you should definitely go and spend some time there. But I've never seen anyone write about this issue specifically, about manuscript circulation, and it would be interesting to know more if this is really a strategy.
Definitely, because I kind of got the impression that perhaps people reading the Lettre Pastorale were probably perhaps felt under kind of pressure to present their story in a certain way to warrant inclusion and publication, and I wonder if that might have influenced what people decided to include.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thanks. Well, Tommy, you want to weigh in?
I'll talk a little about the exhibition. Thank you very much, Owen, for your very kind introduction to the paintings. Strangely, I kind of feel that what I did links really well into Thomas and Nora, into what you've done. You posed the question, Owen, really about how the refugees are seen today and memory of the refugees. And I think they're seen as a historic group, as a group of people from our past who have layered onto them, I think, our values. So people now see them very much as the founders of our values and the people who established our values. Whether they were or not, I really don't know. I think it's a case of us laying their values over them. But it was really fascinating, Nora and Thomas, to see how the refugees existed when they were in the minority and when they were persecuted. And I could see so many traces of what I see here now with Protestants in Northern Ireland. And perhaps we do have the same values, but we seem to have a very similar way of responding to the threat and the same mindset. So, Thomas, when you're saying they remained loyal to the king and they didn't get themselves involved in any of that type of rebellious behavior, there's very much the mindset here that in the Bible, the phrase "give unto Caesar what is Caesar's," that those kind of worldly requirements you shouldn't be involving yourself in. If Caesar's the king, you treat him as the king and you give what credit he's due. You don't rebel against that. You accept that authority, but you still hold strong to your faith. And Nora, in a passage of yours were challenged, the response was, where do you see in the Bible that there's different access to reading for the different genders? Where would a woman not be as entitled to read the Bible? And that's very much the mindset here as well, where amongst the Protestant community, the Bible is the source, not the church, not anything else. So that reference to what's in the Bible and following the Bible. And there is that underlying trend that of whilst we're 53, 54%, whatever, of the majority in the north of Ireland, that's a small corner in Ireland. And we are very much in the minority, and we're very much in a minority area where the rest of the island would like to take that part. And there is very much a sense that being Irish is being seen to be being Catholic, and that we would be very unwelcome in the larger island, and our treatment may not be good. Now, I'm not saying that that is the truth, and I'm not even saying that I would hold that mindset, but it is very much the mindset of the under siege minority who seem to respond in ways that are suggested by your two papers. So I think it's a lovely thing to be able to see what the response was back then and to be able to view it on to now. And how lovely is it that today is the International Day of the Refugee? It's absolutely fantastic timing for us. So I think whilst mine is not the academic paper, it actually is the part that maybe ties the two papers together nicely.
Yeah, no, I think that memory is a hugely important issue in Huguenot history, and one of the biggest issues, I think, in terms of histories of the refuge and just trying to kind of understand, because I know, I mean, in American history, but also in South African history and various parts of Europe where the refugees were, there was kind of a relatively quick fading away of the refugees as a real demographic force, as an independent French presence, followed by this, mostly in the 19th century, this kind of recreation of memory, which, as you say, is very much, I think, along different national models. So in the United States, it's very tied up with the idea of religious freedom, and in South Africa too, in ways that are sort of tied up also with apartheid in ways that are kind of problematic. But Ireland seems to play a very particular role. I mean, it's similar in that the Huguenots have this kind of unique role within kind of a society of Protestants and Catholics. But yeah, I'm just interested to hear more of kind of the local perspective on how how they're kind of considered. Are Huguenots, like, would the average Irish person know about the Huguenot contribution to Ireland?
The central kind of story in the religious difference tends to be the Battle of the Boyne. And that has assumed a completely different meaning and set of values. Again, the population now has layered on their meanings and their values onto that perception as well. But I think the general person in the street would be aware that William of Orange, when he came across, he was bringing with him Dutch soldiers, Dutch Blue Guard, and he was bringing with him refugee French soldiers who had been driven out of France and who saw the persecution following them. And the general perception would be that a lot of James's army would have been funded by France, would have been French mercenaries, would have been, you know, on loan from the King of France. So there would be that understanding of the Huguenots as part of the French side of the William army, who were fighting against the non-Huguenot French side of James's army, but very, very much with a contemporary and modern overlay, in much the same way that actually that the paintings are taking motifs and rearranging them and creating collages and creating contemporary work. We've almost done the same thing with the story and with the events of the Huguenots and their experiments. We have taken bits and pieces, we have rearranged them, repositioned them, and created our contemporary story over the top of it. And I guess the people in the street are much more guilty of that than the academics who continue to try to dig down into what was their story and what was their sets of values, as opposed to what we have subsequently layered over the top. Mm-hmm. Is that fair, Nora, do you think? Is that do you get that sense of people in the street?
It's really interesting to hear your perspective, as I'm from the Republic of Ireland, so we kind of we're familiar a bit with the history of the North, but haven't kind of lived it obviously the way you have. But yeah, I would definitely agree. I'm not sure what the degree of knowledge of the Huguenot contribution to society would be for people in my area in Ireland. I know that I myself first heard about it when I was I think I must have been in undergraduate studies or early college, early secondary school, when I was on a trip to Dublin and came across the Huguenot cemetery there. And as I was already interested in studying French, it kind of sparked that interest for me. But yeah, I think other than the Battle of the Boyne in the history books, there wouldn't be that big of a description of it. But now that I'm doing a project and I'm mostly living in England, I am following a lot of Huguenot museums and stuff throughout the country, and it's really interesting to see the emphasis on the fact that you know, this was a very positive refugee story. It's kind of sold as, which is really interesting for World Refugee Day. So it's really nice to see these kind of happy narratives of people having been integrated well and having made valuable contributions to society with their skills. But I guess it's also important to kind of recognize the fact that you know, it wasn't just an easily integration and assimilation story. There were challenges associated with moving abroad as well, related to linguistic challenges, cultural challenges and stuff like that as well. So I guess it's important not to gloss over that, as you say, not to just take the nicer elements of the story and use it to our own gains, which I don't think people are doing, but I just think it's a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
When I looked at when I was thinking about your artwork, and I was wondering about, first, why did they ever go to Ireland? So to me, that was a bit of a surprise, because I did not know that there were that many that went to Ireland. But I have looked at the Huguenots who had come to the United States, not the States, it was the colonies in those days. And and they did found a number of communities and actually established a number of churches, which barely lasted 2 generations before they assimilated into the general population. And what I found surprising is that most of them became Anglicans. American Anglican Church at that time was mostly low church, so that could be a little bit more acceptable than high church variety of services. And the only place that really survived that I know of, and perhaps Owen can correct me on this, was in Charleston, South Carolina, where you still have the Huguenot Church. And until not that many years ago, just in honor of it being the Huguenot Church, once a month they used to give a sermon in French. They don't do that anymore, as far as I know. But they still call it the Huguenot Church, and they still subscribe to the creed of I don't know, 1572 or something like that. But the communities themselves have disappeared. It was interesting. About a half a year ago, in the travel section of the New York Times, there was you could visit various Huguenot sites from New York City all the way up to New Flats. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to do it, but I just, New York is 8 hours away from me, so I didn't do the trip.
Yeah, well, speaking of memorialization, and I don't want to hijack this discussion and turn it about North American Huguenots, but there are lots of very interesting memorial sites, many mm-hmm. of which I visited from New York, and in a town not far from where I live in Massachusetts, there's a very kind of weird memorial to a small short-lived settlement. Down in South Carolina, there's quite a number of them. So, and that I think tells us something about, because most of them were put up in the 19th and 20th centuries when descendant groups kind of decided, well, we need people to remember this chapter of our history.
And there was a Huguenot society that does genealogical studies, and you can become a part of it. Mm-hmm. So just things that I never even knew existed. So, but I'll give you one little story, just my last little North American thing. I thought that it was really rather ironic that the Huguenot Church in New York City, when the congregation disbanded, they sold it to the Catholics, and it became one of the first Catholic churches in New York City. So anyway,
yeah,
I've always been. Pardon?
Same story in Boston.
Same story in Boston. Okay. Anyway.
I'm kind of guessing if you have a church building, there's only so much you can do with it.
That's right.
Take the seal. Take the seal.
Right.
I thoroughly enjoyed Nora's paper. That was really fascinating. And the part that got me was that she could get first letters. That she received letters, that was permitted, and that her mother came to visit her, and and in that kind of situation, I was really very surprised. Was that common, or was it? Did one have to know someone in order to be able to do this?
Yeah, both of those things really surprised me as well. First off, about the mother, she mentions that she's really proud of her parents for the fact that they persevered in their faith. But in his 19th century edition, Theodore Claparède adds a little footnote and says, though she says this, it's presumably that her mother presumably did abjure her faith, at least in word, while she was being held in the prison in Grenoble, because otherwise how she would have become free and being able to visit her daughter later in Hôpital de Valence is unclear. Now she didn't go to visit her until after the director, Henri Guichard d'Arpin, he had been sent to a tribune in Grenoble, I think in 1687, because in fact complaints about his conduct grew to be so strong that he was actually brought to court over them. So it seems that the hospital administration became a little less stringent after his departure, and while it was being overseen by a rector who was a little bit more lenient, that her mother was able to come. Her father also came to visit her while she was injured on her bed, and he wants to take her away, and even for a little while, he says, just to nurse until she gets better, and then he tells the administration that he'll bring her back, and that he has people in the area that can vouch for him and for her whereabouts, and that he'll bring her back, but they tell him that he's not allowed, and that even if he brings them 100 pistols, that he won't be allowed to take her away. But then eventually she is freed, and the rector tells her that he's bringing her out in secret, and that he doesn't want the other administrators to realize that she's being let go, at which stage quite a number of her fellow inmates had already managed to leave during this kind of period of leniency, by paying sums of money. So she kind of paints it as if she's one of the last people left, as it were. About the letters, that was something that was actually not a little bit unclear to me, whether she was sneaking them in, or whether it was kind of official correspondence, because she mentions at one point that while she was being transferred from Grenoble to the Hôpital de Valence, that she has letters on her person that she destroys for fear that the guards in Valence will discover them on her, and that she would be maltreated because of this. But she continues to enter into this correspondence. So I think she did have a friend on the inside. I think she does mention that she has someone who helps her smuggle letters in and out. But at one stage as well, her fellow inmate who's in the same room as her after they escape and they hurt their legs, the hospital rector comes to her and tells her that a letter has arrived for her, telling her that her husband has died. So it does seem that they were able to get some letters by official channels as well, and that he's able to relay, that he doesn't mind relaying the information about her husband dying to her and passing on that letter. So whether the letters from Pastor Moura are from a kind of an official channel that was allowed to be handed through by the administration, or whether they were kind of part of the ones that she transferred more secretively, wasn't 100% clear. So that's something that I'm looking to delve into more as well.
I was just
really enjoyed, Nora. Sorry, I really enjoyed, Nora, the way you told the story of her mother coming to visit, and you could almost feel the pain of the mother, and you got a real sense of the relationship between the mother and the daughter in that scenario, and it's exactly how a mother would respond today to a daughter who was so determined in such a dangerous position. So very enjoyable part of the story, really. Sorry,
yeah,
Thomas.
Oh, sorry.
And when you say that her mother must have abjured, was it just for the occasion, because that was a way of being able to get access? I mean, it's the same way, I'm just thinking of the way after the revocation, those who stayed behind very often would officially be baptized, officially, so that they were officially Catholic, and they would also go to church have a Catholic wedding, so that they would also be able to be given a proper burial. I'm just wondering, is that part of the scene? Were you able to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because she doesn't really mention what specifically her mother did. I imagine that it was just that she kind of said that she would convert in order to be free from the prison in Grenoble, because then she does travel to Switzerland with Blanche and settle there, but she actually dies there just a year or two after arriving, sadly. But they do make that journey, and then it seems that they kind of restart their life there within the Huguenot community. So I imagine she did, in her heart, continue to be a Protestant. About the scene where the mother visits her, what I thought was interesting was the fact that Gamon also, when describing this, she uses the phrase "ses entrailles sont émues," and entrailles can mean womb in French, but as well, I was reading this Dictionnaire de la langue sainte from the 17th century, and it was telling me that apparently this phrase saying that someone's innards were moved. Well, even now we sometimes think of the innards as being the seat of the emotions, but apparently at that time it was an action more associated with women as well. So I thought it was quite interesting kind of feminine aspect of that. It also kind of called to mind to me the whole scene, the kind of scene of Mary at the foot of the cross, kind of unable to help Jesus and his suffering. So it had an interesting parallel with that in my mind.
Well, we're close to the end here, but does anyone have a final question or comment that you want to make about anyone's papers or the papers in as a whole?
I really thought they fit together very, very nicely, but Nora, continue, please.
Oh, I actually had a question for you. I was wondering about in your mentions of in the Mazarinad, a lot of discussion about Protestantism. And I think you said that someone talking about the English Civil War described it as being kind of a war of three religions, I guess, including Anglicanism and Puritanism against Catholicism. But I was wondering, is there any mention of Judaism as well and Jewish people in France? I think you were saying that there was some mention about the Inquisition in Spain having failed because it didn't convert Muslims. So I was wondering, is there any kind of mention of Jewish people in your letters?
Nothing. Well, there's about in the Mazarinad, there are a number of pamphlets that are about the Jews, and they are not very nice ones. And they have been cataloged, and what's her name, Zosha Zayevsky has looked at them, but I think they need another look. But they usually deal with the Jews who lived in Paris, and there was at least one, let's call it, I can't say a pogrom, but at least one attack on the Jews during the Fronde. They did not really participate in the Fronde, but they were brought into it because, again, they were the minority. And then, of course, you have the differences. There were the Jews who lived in Paris, the Jews who lived in closer to the German border near Alsace, and the other ones who lived down near Bordeaux, and they are the ones who escaped the Inquisition in Spain. So they were the Sephardic Jews, as opposed to the Ashkenazi who were living in the north. And they didn't understand one another very well. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Great. Well, sadly, we have reached the end of our time, so I just wanted to thank all of you once again for wonderful papers and for a really stimulating discussion as well that I think demonstrates pretty clearly just how many kind of new avenues there are in the history of the Huguenots and hopefully of some of the great work that'll be appearing in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a delight.
Everyone.
Qui attend